I'm Professor Katherine, Associate Professor of New Testament at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and this is the Architects of Hope series. Today I'm going to share with you Kister Stendahl's Paul Among Jews and Gentiles, a book which completely changed the way I read Paul's letters in the New Testament, and as a lifelong Lutheran, that's saying something. Kister Stendahl was a pastor, a New Testament scholar, a divinity school dean, and the Lutheran Bishop of Sweden in the 1980s. And for all his later churchiness, he did not grow up going to church or reading the Bible. Eventually, though, someone gave him a New Testament, and in his own words, he was hooked for life. So fast forward through a doctorate in New Testament, a couple of books on the Gospel of Matthew, several prominent professorships, and an appointment at dean at Harvard, and Stendahl was invited to address the American Psychological Association. This address, entitled "The Apostle Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West," forms the heart of Paul Among Jews and Gentiles. In it, Stendahl questions the most fundamental assumption about the New Testament that readers of Paul's letters make. That is, that Paul's conscience troubled him, and ours should trouble us too. And here's where Stendahl asks just one tiny, obvious, but ultimately, at least for me, theology-shattering question. What if Paul really wasn't bothered by his sinfulness at all? Yeah, you heard that correctly. Stendahl contends that Paul is not concerned with his sin and shame as much as he is with how in the world Jews and Gentiles can live together in community with the same God. Now, if you were in my class at Wake Div, you'd hear me read lots of passages from Philippians and Romans and Galatians, passages that take on an entirely new meaning when we ask this question of Jewish-Gentile relations rather than one of salvation from sin. From Galatians 3, verses 24 through 26. Therefore, the law was our custodian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a custodian. For in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. Notice that shift in pronouns? From the we to the you? The Christ-following Galatians were Gentiles mostly, but they knew some Jewish folks, and they knew that Jewish folks observed their faith in God by following the law of Moses. So some of the Galatians decided to try it out, even though they weren't Jews. And this made Paul really mad. And notice, when Paul uses we, he's talking about himself and his fellow Jews. And then he shifts to talk about you, and he's talking directly to the Gentile Galatians. Paul and his Jewish friends, the we, were already children of God. And Paul's good news to the Galatians, and good news for us Gentiles today, is that that heritage as children of God is not limited to the Jews. You Gentiles are also God's children. Notice that Paul never once says, and God requires the Jews to become like you. Fundamentally, the heart of the community in Christ is a community with cultural, ethnic, and even religious differences at its center. I was privileged enough to know Stendahl in the last years of his life when I was a young pastor and scholar. In fact, he graciously sat in the pews as I learned the art of preaching and the craft of liturgy, and often had helpful tips for me as I shook his hand at the church door. I asked him once how he even knew to ask this question about Paul and how Jews and Gentiles can live together. Stendahl came of age during World War II and witnessed firsthand the atrocities perpetuated against Jews in the name of Christianity. And as a young priest in the Church of Sweden, he often heard confessions from soldiers who had been in the war and had fought against the Germans and had liberated concentration camps. So often he heard them struggle with their own individual sin as the cause of so much systemic evil. And he wondered, maybe we'd gotten Paul entirely wrong. Stendahl notes, I learned that the Bible was not about me. but it was teaching me about God's way of dealing with the world, with people, with tensions between people of different faiths. The Bible, Paul's letters, Christ's promises, they were about difference, about people, about communities. Why does this matter? Because if the communities to which Paul wrote were struggling with how to live with each other with their religious differences and their gender differences and their sexuality differences and differences in their heritage and their cultural differences and the ways that they had perpetuated injustice against each other, if the communities to which Paul wrote were struggling with these issues, then Stendahl helps us to see our own communities with all of our differences, even with our legacies of injustices. Our own communities today can find some pretty good company with these ancient Christ-following communities in Rome, in Corinth, Philippi, Thessaloniki, Ephesus, Galatia, you name it. And the correspondence Paul has with these communities give us some pretty good material to work through as we become workers for justice and compassion in our own world. Thank you for watching. Please check back soon for another episode of Architects of Hope from the Wake Forest University School of Divinity.